why did they take offense? What was so offensive about Jesus? What was it that he was teaching or saying that was so offensive? Well, many times, I believe, people get shaken by transformation. People look and see something like that, and they can get shaken by it. They can get intimidated. They can get defensive about it because our default attitude, most of the time, if we're going to be perfectly honest, is I can't, right? Like we say to ourselves, nah, I can't, right? Or I wouldn't do that. I would never. I couldn't. I shouldn't. I won't. And right, we say these things to ourselves. I don't have what it takes. And so that's the response. But when you see someone who says, well, actually, I have done it, and I am doing it right now, so maybe actually you can, right? That shakes us. That challenges us. And how are we going to respond to that? We could respond like the people in his hometown did, where it says he could not do, therefore, many miracles in that town, right? We could be those kind of people. We could be that kind of church. Or we can be the kind of people who respond not with I can't, but as the disciples did when Jesus calls to Simon Peter and he says, cast your nets on the other side. And Peter like pushes back and he's like, I don't know. And then he's like, but because you say so, I will, right? Not I can't, but because you say so, I will do it, right? And so that is what it means to be a disciple, to be reshaped in the way that we think. And so we're going to look today at 3 ways that Jesus reshapes us. An encounter with Jesus can reshape us. And the first one is that Jesus reshapes our lifestyle. You know, I believe that we have in us a yearning to be a part of something more, to be a part of something that's greater than ourselves. That yearning that was deep down inside of David Goggins. I want to be a part of something more. We're going to watch a short video. If you could cue that video up. We're going to watch a short video here. And this is a recruitment video for the Marines. And so we'll see these sometimes, maybe before a movie or something like that. Check it out.
For every generation, it has started with the call to serve. Discovering the purpose and the belonging earned with the title. Learning to dig deep and push through adversity together. Defending our nation and its people. It is a life of great worth and reward. But Marines are never really finished serving. Their commitment comes full circle, visible in communities across our country. This is Semper Fidelis, always faithful, always Marine, marking a path for the next generation.
Yeah, so those videos, man, it's pretty effective recruitment video, right? I mean, you're like, oh my gosh, like I want to do that. I want to be a part of something great like that. And that video speaks to a bunch of things that like go deep. They're almost kind of spiritual things, right? It talks about purpose, belonging, overcoming adversity, having a sense of worth for your life. It talks about community, all of those kinds of things that we all hunger for, and overcoming obstacles. For David Goggins, his kind of journey was that he decided, I want to be a Navy SEAL, right? Like, I'm going to be a Navy SEAL, which if you know anything about the armed forces, like the Marines and the Navy SEAls, they're all kind of looked at as like, man, like the toughest people on the planet. So he says, I'm going to become a Navy SEAL. And you think about the qualifications, or you think about the challenge of that it's not for the weak of heart. It's not for those who say I can't, but only for those who say I will, right? It's only for those who say, you know, it's going to take training. It's going to take diligence and discipline and courage and commitment. This is the challenge that's placed out there. And so the bar is not like way down here, like, you know, like the bar is up here, man. And the thing is like, hey, that's, you know, like not everybody's gonna rise to that challenge, but you could, right? And it calls it out of us. I believe, friends, that we actually need a little bit of a restoration of this kind of thinking when it comes to the kingdom of God. I really think that that's actually true. Now, let me say this. We want to be a place that's welcoming, right? I've talked about the importance of this. We want to be a place where it's like you come in, you know, it's warm, it's welcoming, you get your coffee, you know, it's friendly, and there's fellowship and all those kinds of things. That's really super important. Come as you are, all those kinds of things. But we must not lose sight of the fact that it's come as you are, but don't stay as you are. right? That this is a place that it calls us to a challenge. It calls us to be greater and to rise and to be more than we are. And I think that the Western church has largely lost a little bit of that. We've sort of become the country club, down the road, right? It's like, oh, you go to the, you sit in the cushy chair, you hear a little, cushy thing or whatever it might be, you kind of greet your friends. But I believe that joining the kingdom of God, joining up with Jesus, is actually in some ways more like joining the Marines. It's more like joining the Navy SEALs than it is just joining the country club down the road, right? And there is a challenge to that, and I think that speaks to something in us. If we go further down in Mark chapter 6, in verse 6, Jesus sends out his disciples. He says that he sends them out to village, and he sends them out to cast out demons, and he sends them out to heal the sick. And he says, don't take extra money with you. Don't even take an extra pair of shoes or anything like that. He says, I want you to just go out there as you are, and you're going to meet resistance, and there's going to be adversity to overcome, but you will overcome because I'm going to be sending you out in the same power and authority that was given me. And he sends them out. When David Goggins first joined the Marine Corps, there's a thing that, or not the Marine Corps, the Navy SEALs, there's a thing that they go through called Hell Week. Okay, so just imagine for a second, right? Hell Week, okay, it's described in this way for a reason. They put them through the hardest things imaginable that anybody can go through, right? It's incredibly, incredibly difficult. And the first time that Goggins goes through this, he fails miserably. And he doesn't succeed. He says, no, I can do this. I can come back. And so he asks, can I do it again? And he tries again. He goes and he trains and he tries again. And he fails again. And he fails 2 times. But then he begs him. He's like, no, give me one more chance. He's like, I believe that I can do this. I believe that I can overcome. I believe. And so they give him one more chance. And on the 3rd try, he goes through 3 hell weeks. And the 3rd try, he overcomes. He succeeds. He becomes a Navy SEAL. And this, what Jesus is sending these disciples out to do, this isn't Hell Week, but I do believe it is Heaven Week, right? It is Kingdom Week. He's like, guys, you're going out, and there's going to be adversity, but you're going to overcome, and you're going to press through, and you're going to do the stuff. And when we do that, when we press through, when we push against the obstacle, and we overcome the adversity, that there's great reward on the other side of this. In verse 12, the disciples returned. It says they went out, they preached that people should repent, and they drove out many demons, and they anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. How about if that was a description of your week? Right? Like, somebody asks, hey, how you doing? Well, I'm working, it's good, the kids are okay, we're doing things or whatever. But yeah, actually, I had a pretty cool week now that you mention it. Like, the other day at Walgreens, as I was out there, getting some toothpaste or whatever, like somebody comes up to me, like we were talking about earlier, like Gordon was saying, and I lay my hands on her, and next thing you know, the person's manifesting a demon, and I cast out many demons at Walgreens. It's like, and then, in fact, then they threw me out of Walgreens after that because it was chaos, and the toothpaste was getting everywhere. And then the next day, on Wednesday, I'm like, I'm going to get gas, and there's somebody, and they got a little limp or something like that. They got something going on with their leg. And so I said, can I pray for you? And I prayed for them, and they got healed, and I anointed many people, and healed them at the gas station on Wednesday. And we laugh, we say, that's silly. But that was literally the disciples' week. Like, that was it. Like, that's what it was, man. Like, that's what they did. Like, what a week to have. Like, how about that? Like, how about coming to church on Sunday and be like, you will not believe what happened this week. Like, you will not believe what happened in Walmart, man. Like, Walmart can get weird, but, man, it got really weird this week because Jesus showed up, and I was there. And so, we think about that. We think about it doesn't start there, though, right? Like, it didn't start there for the disciples. It certainly didn't start there for David Goggins. It doesn't start there for us. It started with a change of lifestyle. It started with a little bit of everyday change. We talked about this earlier this year, at the beginning of the year. We talked about the importance of little, incremental, everyday change, right? You don't just go to the finish line overnight. It takes a little bit of change. A little further down, it says that he dismissed the crowd. And after leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Jesus goes away, and he spends time praying. Elsewhere, it says in verse 31, Jesus says to the disciples, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. And so they went away in a boat to a solitary place. This is the practice of what we call spiritual disciplines. This is the practice of what we call silence and solitude. taking time away, turning off the phone, spending time with God, reading the Word of God, listening for God, talking to God, maybe doing a little journaling, whatever it is. That's the kind of lifestyle that is like pumping iron, that builds the muscles, that gets you in shape, that begins to change the way that you live, that changes the way that you think, that changes who you are from the inside out. And it happens one little day at a time. And my question for you is, how's your lifestyle? How's your lifestyle doing? We talked about this in January. We talked about, hey, do you have a morning ritual? Do you have a little morning thing? Do you get up with your coffee? Do you crack open the Word of God? Do you talk with Him a little bit on your way to work? Or do you take some time? Do you practice the presence of God even during your day, when you're in the car or going for a walk, whatever? Are you taking the time? Are you taking some of the discipleship workshops that we offer? Are you investing in your own discipleship? I'll just a little side here, but at the end of the summer, we're going to do something where we're going to try something different. We're going to do a discipleship day, and we're going to be doing learning to display, and it's all about this. How do you heal the sick? How do you hear from God? How do you work in the supernatural and signs and wonders? And we're going to do that. Are you taking time to invest in those kinds of things in yourself? Or, as many times with fitness, did you get a couple of months in? Here we are in June, right? End of June. And did you get a couple of months in and kind of, it sort of fell off, right? Like you started, and then you got like halfway through Proverbs, and then you just kind of, right? It just kind of fell apart there. The tape fell out of the VCR, and you're like, I don't know. That's to show how old I am. But nonetheless, but we can get back on, right? Like David Goggins, he fails, and then he gets back up, and he fails, and he gets back up, and then he succeeds, and we can do the same. That's what it means to be a disciple, to have our lifestyles be reshaped. Are you guys with me on that? Yes? Okay. So the second one that we need to look at is it's not just about our lifestyle, but it's also about our attitude. Okay? So it goes a little deeper here, because as we allow Jesus to reshape our lifestyle, pretty soon that shape can start to come into conflict with the shape of our culture. Because our culture has a certain shape, right? And it has a certain shaping influence on us because we're in the culture. And so pretty soon, if Jesus starts to change that shape, next thing you know, all of a sudden, I don't fit in those square holes anymore so much, and we start to butt up against things, and we begin to notice things even about ourselves. And Jesus allows us sometimes to go through experiences that give us an attitude check. Like what's going on inside of you. And so this is what happens in verse 33. And so they're going away to rest. They're going to spend time with God, spiritual disciplines. But then the crowd comes, right? Now the crowd is following them. And it's like this, it's like they're tired, man. They just got back from Heaven Week, right? They just got back from casting out many demons. And all of a sudden the crowd shows up and they're like, we're going to do more? Like, it's time for a snack. It's time for a nap. It's time to rest. And you know that Jesus, I'm sure, felt the same way. But when that happens, when we get down to the bottom of the barrel, it's like we have to reach deep, And it's like then there's something deep down inside, and we grab hold of, like, what's really down there, like the attitude, like what's deep, deep down inside of ourselves. And we pull from that. And for Jesus, when he reaches down inside of himself, what comes out? It says when he saw the large crowd, he had what? Compassion on them. And so he began teaching them many things. Ray talked about this last week. Compassion, the heart of God, is what is deep down inside of Jesus. That's his attitude. That's what he reaches down and grabs hold of when he's reaching in the bottom of the barrel. When you get squeezed, right? When you get squeezed, what comes out, right? What is it? Like when you get to the bottom of the barrel, when you're really getting crunched, like what is it that comes out, right? Like, it's what's deep down inside. And for Jesus, it was compassion is what came out. Now, for me, typically, it's a little different. Usually when I get squeezed, when I get tired or hungry or decaffeinated or, just kind of like irritated or too hot or too cold or too wet or too dry or whatever it is, right? Like, you name anything. What usually comes out of me is irritation, right? Like, I get a little bit grumpy and I'm like, don't talk to me. I haven't had my caffeine yet. Or I'm hungry right now. Like, let me go get my lunch. We'll talk afterward. I get a little hangry. Does anybody ever get that way? Yeah, okay, so, all right, just so I'm not the only one here. Yeah, if you get squeezed, like what comes out? And it's that way for the disciples. They get a little squeezed, and compassion is not what comes out for them, right? What comes out is they get a little irritated. They get a little annoyed. They said, this is a remote place. It's very late. We're tired. We're hungry. Send the people away so they can go to the countryside and buy themselves something to eat. Now, we're going to come back to this in just a second here, but I want to take just a quick sidebar. Think about this. Who is this crowd that they're looking at? The crowd, I believe, is a snapshot of the culture. It's like the culture around them. It's that shaping sort of influence. And what is this Jewish culture like at the time? Well, the crowd is not well-to-do people. It's poor people, right? It's poor people. In today's sort of parlance, it's the working class. It's you could say the marginalized people in their society. It is the people who have been oppressed. They're the victims of systematic racism, right? They are. Like, they're the Jewish people being oppressed by the Romans, who are a foreign nation that have come in. They've got some PTSD. They've seen people be crucified beside the road. Like, they've seen crazy, crazy stuff. They're hurt. They're injured. They're victims, right? And they've experienced all of those kinds of things. David Goggins had some of those kinds of experiences in his life. He was abused as a child pretty badly. He had a father who was very physically and emotionally abusive to him. He was as a young black man growing up in the Midwest. The Ku Klux Klan was in his town. Like, there was serious racism. There were people who threatened him and called him all kinds of terrible things. And for a long time, that was what shaped his attitude. That was what shaped his perspective and the way that he saw himself and the way that he saw others. And so I think that that's kind of a snapshot of the culture. And now we go back to the passage here and we look at the crowd. And what do we notice about the crowd? Well, the first thing we notice is they didn't pack a lunch. Right? Like, they came to find Jesus and they didn't bring anything with them. They just showed up. Now, most of the time, I think, if you're a family, you've got kids or whatever, you go on a trip, what do? You get the kids in the minivan, but you make sure everybody's got their snack, everybody's got their applesauce or their goldfish crackers, everybody's maybe got a little water, they've got a little fidget toy, they got a little something to play with, a little movie to watch, whatever it is. Like, you get everybody ready to go before you leave, right? Like, this is common sense. Well, these people didn't do that, right? And why didn't they do that? I believe it's that when we've experienced those kinds of things, when we've been hurt or when we've been stepped on and all that kind of stuff, we have a tendency to develop what I would call a victim mentality, right? And it's a mentality that says, feed me. Feed me. I can't feed myself. I can't do for myself. I can't take care of myself. I'm not going to take responsibility. Somebody else feed me. Somebody else take care of me. Somebody else. It's this kind of, you might call it entitlement, right? And it is a sort of a thing that was present in their culture. And I think it's a thing that's kind of present in our culture today to some extent, right? And we're not going to point any fingers, but I think it's pretty easy to see that there is this sort of oppressed narrative that's kind of around us, and it rubs off on us. But this is the interesting thing. Jesus does not confront this by calling out the crowd. He doesn't. He doesn't point the finger. He doesn't call out the crowd. What does he do instead? Well, he turns to the disciples, and he says to them, you give them something to eat. Now, isn't that interesting? Jesus turns to the church. He turns to his disciples and he says, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do to be a force for good? What are you going to do to help others? What he's saying there is this. He said, this is the attitude of your culture, but it's not your attitude. You do not get to say, somebody else do it. Oh, put them off to somebody else. Somebody else will take care of it. Somebody else will do it. No. What are you going to do about it? What do you bring to the table? That is what a reshaping of our attitude looks like. David Goggins got to a point where he just said to himself at one point, he said, you know what? I've gone through all kinds of terrible things in my life, but I'm not going to see myself as a victim anymore. That is not who I am. That is not the way I'm going to define myself. I am going to be an overcomer. I'm going to be someone who overcomes adversity. And we can't and listen to me, understand. I'm not saying that victimization doesn't happen. I'm not saying that abuse isn't real. I'm not saying that racism doesn't happen. I'm not saying any of those kinds of things. Pain and suffering is real, but we don't a lot of times have power over that. What we do have power over is the way that we see ourselves, the way that we see others, the attitude with which we take that we take to our lives. And we need to be willing to change that attitude. And that's what Jesus says. And so Jesus says to the disciples, what do you have? And the disciples, how many loaves do you have? And this is the lesson here that Jesus is trying to teach. What do you bring to the table, right? Like, what do you bring? It's not what don't you have, it's what do you have to bring to the table. And God will work with what you have, but you've got to be willing to bring something. And the disciples, they put their hands in their pockets and they, do one of these. I don't know, I don't have much, kind of one of those. And then Jesus is like, and I think he says it like this too. He says, go and see. like, go and see what you have. Go on, go do it. And then they go out, and it says, when they found out, they came back and they said, 5 loaves, 2 fish. Now, funny thing about this here. Now, this crowd, right? Just think about this for a second. This is 5,000 men, okay, plus women and children. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about maybe 15,000 people, maybe 20,000 people, a ton of people. What do you think the chances are that in a crowd of 15,000 people, you could find more than 5 people that packed a lunch? Just do the math, man. It's not, right? I guarantee you there was more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. So either, there's one of 2 things happening here, maybe both. Either the disciples aren't looking very hard, number one, because they're like, well, see, Jesus, they don't have anything. Or those people are like, I'm keeping my Cheerios to myself, right? They're like, I did bring a little bit, but that's not for anybody else. That's for me. I'm not sharing it with 15,000 other people, right? And so both of these are expressions of that kind of attitude. The cultural attitude of it's about me, feed me, right? I'm not going to share. It's not about what I bring to the table here as well. And so Jesus, though, he doesn't rough them up. He just takes it. He's like, okay. He takes the 5 loaves, he takes the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and he broke it. And here is the second lesson of Jesus there. So first is, what do you bring? The second one is, have you given thanks for what you have? Right? Have you actually taken stock of your 5 loaves and your 2 fish, which isn't much, but have you thanked God and said, God, thank you for what I have. Thank you that I'm here today. Thank you that I've got my health. Thank you that I've got my family. Thank you that I've got a little bit of a little bit of leeway. Thank you for all the things that you've given to me. And that is the model that he makes for them. And we know the rest of the story. The food is multiplied, everybody eats, everybody has enough. It's this incredible miracle, and at the end, they pick up 12 baskets of broken pieces. Now, who do you think those 12 baskets of broken bread are for? 12 disciples, exactly right. Do you think Jesus is trying to teach a lesson here? Right? Do you think he's trying to get something across that God will provide, right? But we need to bring something to the table. We need to give thanks for what we have, right? And not see ourselves the way that the culture might want us to see ourselves with that kind of victim narrative. Are you guys with me on that? Is this good? Okay. Let's go to the last one here. So Jesus wants to reshape our lifestyle. He wants to reshape our attitude so that when we dig deep, we get to the heart of God and not the other thing. But the last one is that Jesus wants to reshape our hearts. And this is so important. So Jesus, I think, at this point, I'm kind of reading between the lines, but I think Jesus is a little ticked off at this point. He's kind of like, you know what? Guys, I need some me time after this, and y'all can think about what we learned today, okay? And we'll talk about it in the morning. See you later, guys. And so Jesus goes up on the mountain to be with God, right? So he's like, I'm going to have some me time. And the disciples, meanwhile, get in the boat, and they start rowing across the lake. Well, while this is happening, it says that, let me back up for a second. I think that many times when God kind of leaves us to our own devices, when Jesus leaves us to our own devices, we start to think, and we might start to figure out what the problem was, right? We might start to say oh, you know what? I think actually that was kind of what we did wrong there. Maybe they're talking amongst themselves. But a lot of times we come to the wrong conclusions, We'll identify the problem, oh, that's what the problem is, right? But we jump to the wrong conclusions. A lot of times we swing to the other extreme, right? And a lot of times that's the case. I think that that is very much the case with David Goggins, which just a little disclaimer about David Goggins, by the way, if you look him up, lots of profanity in his videos, okay? So he's a sailor, and he swears like a sailor, so disclaimer on that. So we're not endorsing David Goggins here. But one of the things about him is that he has a lot of anger. Like, you can tell. Like, there's tremendous rage, like, inside of him. And one of the things that he always says, his slogan is this. He says, stay hard. You've got to stay hard, man. Because why? Because you've got to be the toughest. You've got to be the strongest. Because nobody else is going to rescue you. Nobody else is going to save you. You've got to carry the boats. You've got to carry the logs. You've got to be the one that's going to go the distance because nobody else is going to do it for you. So you have got to stay hard. And friends, sometimes when we're living in a culture that celebrates weakness and feed me and all that kind of stuff, what can happen to our hearts? Our hearts can swing over to the other side and become hardened, right? And that's something that can happen. And I believe that that's kind of what happened to the disciples here. And so what happens is Jesus lets them get into a situation. They come to a conclusion that's like, oh, Jesus is trying to teach us that we have to do everything ourselves. Right? Like, we have to bring all of the food. We've got to make sure that we know everything, and we've got to make sure that we're doing everything and working really hard. And so Jesus allows them to get into a situation where they cannot carry the boat because they're in the boat. Right? Have you ever been in a situation where, like, you can't carry the boat because it's the boat you're in, right? And so they get into a boat, and it says that he sees them from the shore, and he sees the disciples straining at the oars. A storm comes up, because the wind was against them. Have you ever been there in your life? Have you ever been straining at the oars and you're just like, I'm just not getting anywhere? Like, why am I not getting anywhere? And you row harder. And you're like, oh, man, I think we can do this. I know we can do this. I know just push harder, push harder. But the wind is against you. And you're just getting blown back. And you're just going like this, right? And Jesus lets them get in a situation. You know what he does then? He lets them stay there until dawn. So he lets them get into a situation where they cannot possibly do it themselves. They can't do it. And then he lets them stay there and lets them try to. They get to the point where they've exhausted themselves completely. And then he goes to them walking on the water. Now, this is maybe the craziest miracle of all time. I don't know, like one of them. I mean, the resurrection's hard to top that. But this is like up there, the Jesus Hall of Fame. He's walking across a lake. This is nuts. Have you ever thought about that? That's crazy. He's walking across the lake. And let me tell you this. This is the thing that's so interesting in Mark's account. He says that the disciples didn't notice him. He's walking across the lake, and the disciples don't see him. Why? Do you think it could be because they're too busy rowing their boat? They're too busy trying to do it themselves. They're too busy trying to save themselves that they don't see God's activity, that they don't see the presence of Jesus in their life. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been so busy trying to save yourself and Jesus is walking to you and you don't even realize it? And then it says, this is the scariest thing, man. Check this out, verse 48. He was about to pass them. Like, wait a minute, like what? Like, just hold the phone. Like, Jesus is doing the craziest miracle of all time. He walks across a lake and then he sees the disciples. They don't see him and he sees something in them that so turns him off that he's like, you know what, I'm just going to keep walking. Like, yo, think you know, if you think you can row that boat, like, keep rowing, guys. I'm just going to walk to the other side because you clearly haven't learned the lesson yet, right? And it says, but when they saw him walking on the lake, this is so funny, they thought he was a ghost, right? Like, I mean, can you imagine? Like, they're so, like, not thinking about Jesus that they literally see Jesus, and they're like, oh, my gosh, it's a ghost. Right? Like, have you ever been there where you were like, you know, they're more willing to turn to superstition than it maybe it's possibly Jesus coming to rescue me. Let me ask you this. Have you ever had a situation where you're like, oh my gosh, like that could have gone terribly. Man, that was lucky. Have you ever done that? You're like, oh my goodness, wow, thank goodness that was lucky. Right? But we do it all the time. How many times do we, you know, like almost get into a car accident and be like, oh my gosh, that was, wow, I'm so glad, you know, I lucked out there. But like maybe that's God. Maybe that was Jesus right there protecting us in that situation. And it says they cried out because they saw him and were terrified. And I love this. Jesus, though, he lets them have it, right? You know, he's like, you know what? I know you're just screaming because you think I'm a ghost and you're scared and you're all terrified and all the rest. He says, but you know what? I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. We're going to just say that that's you crying out to me for help, and I'm going to respond to that, right? Like that's Jesus, that he meets them where they're at. He says, I'll take that. Immediately he spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. And then he climbed into the boat. The wind died down. They were completely amazed. Listen to this, verse 52. For they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Guys, they thought that Jesus wanted them to do everything themselves. They didn't understand with their minds because their hearts had been hardened. Guys, we need to have both. The answer to the problem of the cultural attitude is not to harden our hearts. It is that we need to have the right attitude in our minds, but we've also got to have the right kind of softness in our hearts. This is what our culture needs. We need to be able to find this middle ground between the two. And that middle ground, by the way, I'll just say this, is not mediocrity. David Goggins says, I hate mediocrity. And so, so he swings off to this extreme end of the spectrum with the hardness, stay hard. But this is not mediocrity, friends. God hates mediocrity too. What we're talking about is what we in the Vineyard will call the radical middle, right? It's that middle ground. Jesus calls it the straight and narrow. Over here, you've got hardness over heart. Over here, you've got victim mentality. So where are we going? We're going after Jesus, right down the middle, that we would have a hardness of mind towards the attitude, the fallen mentality of a fallen world, but have a softness of heart towards God that doesn't say, I'm going to do everything myself, but says, Lord, save me, right? Lord, help me. Here's what I bring to the table. But Lord, I know I can't row the boat because it's the boat I'm in. And friends, we're all in the same boat. We are. We're all in the same boat together. And this is what happens when we put these together. And this is Jesus' great source of strength. Listen to this. This is the end of the story. It says Jesus and the disciples, they get to the other side of the lake. He says, now we're going to retake that test. Right? Remember on the other side when we had the crowd and you guys all kind of goofed up and tried to row across the lake on your own, Okay, let's forget about that, but we're going to try this again. And it says they get to the other side. They anchor there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. Oh, we know it's coming. They ran throughout the whole region, carried the sick on mats to where he was. And he's like, okay, guys, how are we going to respond now? When we dig deep and we're tired, what is it that we're going to reach down to? It says wherever he went, in villages, towns, and countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplace. They begged him to touch even the edge of his cloak, and he doesn't pull back. He doesn't deny. It says instead, all who touched it were healed. Friends, this is what it looks like when we allow Jesus to reshape us in all three of these ways, in our lifestyle, in our attitude, and in our hearts. It looks like this kind of radical compassion, this radical Jesus way that is this middle ground. And this is what we so desperately need in our culture today.